So Rob and I are going to do a bit of a tag team here to talk a little bit about the CanaLien project, which one might say it was a proof of concept, pilot project, what have you, but we don't really want to think about it that way because we want to see it grow into something bigger. But we had to start somewhere, so we're going to run through this, hopefully very quickly, and have some time for questions. And there's the obligatory guess who. We had to make sure we had that on since we're in wonderful Saskatoon. So just by way of a little bit of background, so Rob and I are part of a working group that falls under the Canadian Linked Data Initiative, or the CLDI. I'm not sure if folks have heard about it, but the CLDI is sort of a loose collaborative of academic libraries in Canada that's been around since about the fall of 2015. And it includes, these institutions listed there, and of course always looking for additional members. But the goal of the CLDI really is to try and work together as institutions, as organizations, as individuals to plan, to facilitate, to seek out and provide funding for linked data projects in Canada, in particular trying to grow expertise and experience and skills and knowledge in Canadian academic libraries for working with linked data in a variety of ways. And the hope with CLDI is that by involving different institutions, different individuals within those institutions, that we're able to start bridging between units within libraries. So, for example, between an ITS unit and a bibliographic services unit and public services and so on, that we're able to work across different types of libraries. So still very academic library heavy, but the hope to work with public libraries and special libraries and so on to grow that expertise. And then also thinking about how we can bridge between Canadian, US, and European linked data initiatives. So part of the initiative started because there was a sense that in Canada, in some ways, in the large academic libraries, we were falling a little bit behind our colleagues in the States and in Europe in terms of linked data. And also, the CLDI consists of, several working groups and a steering group. So one of the working groups is a digital projects working group, and that's the working group that Rob and I co-chair, out of which this project grew. And so at a summit that we had last year, our working group decided to push forward with a pilot project or a proof of concept project to demonstrate the power of linked data. And so this is where the CanLien project came from. So the idea was to highlight the wonderful intellectual contributions of graduate students in Canada, PhD students, master's students, by focusing on theses. It's something the institutions share, and they're wonderful, unique resources that each of our institutions has. So we wanted to be able to demonstrate the power of linked data to surface unexpected connections between individuals across topics of study and spanning space and time. And so the team for this project was the Digital Projects Working Group and a wonderful Young Canada Works student, Maharsh Patel, who I have to give a huge shout out to. He worked with us at the U of A over the summer. He's a third-year computing science student. He was very new to linked data, very new to MARC data, which he said was kind of cool, which I thought was nice. And he did an amazing job doing this work over the 4 months of the summer. So just a really quick rundown. These are the institutions who provided records for this pilot project, and we're hoping to grow this, obviously. So the institutions there provided records for this pilot project. In terms of data sources, we asked each institution to provide, as many records as they wanted to or as they could. We tried to get a representative of topics and over time. We asked them also if they could to provide authority data, but for that we really just wanted to see if they could at least provide some URIs for the thesis authors. We received data in MARC format as well as RDF XML and CSV. We also, as I said, asked for authority files if they had them, and were willing to provide them. In terms of working with the data, we made no assumptions other than the fact that if a supervisor appeared numerous times at the same institution, we assumed that individual was the same person, but we didn't try and do any work to reconcile a student who may have done a master's at U of A and done a PhD at University of Toronto, and that was partly just a scope scale issue. And also we wanted to, as part of this, using good linked data practice, to create dereferenceable URIs, authority records for theses, people, and subjects. So over to Rob to give some more technical details.
Short purpose. So yes, we wanted linked open data. We were fed up with formats, so we made sure that the setup used as many formats as you could possibly use. And we also can think that the 90% use case is either the citation or getting the raw thesis to actually read. So you can export everything from CanaLien as a BibTeX citation or a REST citation or query the database yourself or get the PDF of the thesis if you really want it. We want dereferenceable URIs for everything, for the people, for the thesis, for the subject headings, and so on. So in a sense, we've created this authority file out of all of the thesis that we have so far. And finally, and disappointingly, the one format that all of the libraries can always produce are MARC records. So we've created this tool where we can, on an ongoing basis, ingest MARC records back into the system and check for duplicates. Now, it is ontology backed. And the first question you're going to ask me is, why an ontology? We have multiple ontology. We talk about ontology, people start screaming and running from emergency exits, and nobody really knows what it does, and so on. And the reason we have one is part of some fundamental research that Sharon and I have done. We expect a Nature paper anytime soon. But fundamentally, their discovery is that computers and people are actually the same in that they aren't psychic. And if you're going to create an interface or share data, you have to tell both the computer and the people how things work and how you see the world. So we have a very simple ontology. And what it does is reuse a lot of other vocabularies. And this ontology is actually the reverse of an approach like you would see with mods, where you can use everything, including the kitchen sink. This actually restricts what a lot of these vocabularies do, because the only thing we're trying to do is communicate what a thesis is and what it's related to. So we have Dublin Core, and Dublin Core does great things with relationships, but it's not very good on objects. And we have Bibo, which has very good objects and classes for thesis and for degrees. And we have FOF, which is very good at people. And we have FRBR, which is very good at differentiating the work from the expression. And we have Library of Congress, which have done a very nice job at documenting languages and subject headings in English. And we have schema.org, which does a very good job at actually just putting an URL for the actual contents of the thesis. And finally, because this is scholarly work and it should have a genre, we use the core genre ontology to just say this is scholarly work. And then back to the subject headings. Well, it turns out we have a lot of subject headings that aren't in the LOC. And we have this other collection called the Canadian subject headings that is not dereferenceable, so we rehosted that on the CanaLien server. And it does have some French language subject headings, but not enough. So we went over to the French National Library and stole their URIs for their subject headings and used that. And as a complete fallback, we'll actually create our own subject headings if we can't find anything to link to. But there is, and last thing is we do provenance. So anytime we get a record, we can track back who gave it to us, when it ran, and what piece of software actually did the processing. And that's so we can actually roll back any transactions we don't like or we think we had a problem. So the result is this. And this is actually quite simple, but it documents in a way that is human readable and machine readable at the same time what exactly you're getting on the output of the CanaLien server. So the infrastructure, well, it's a VM from Westgrid. University of Alberta actually owns a domain name on which it runs, so we have long-term stability from that perspective. It's a virtual triple store. We have a number of scripts that will do export, import in multiple formats. We have daily data dumps. We have Twitter integration. We have provenance. And this is the part where Sharon started thinking that Maharsh and I were going a little bit off the deep end. But we also dislike doing any kind of UI work. So anytime there's an exception, instead of actually creating our own UI, we actually create a GitHub ticket. And by abusing the markdown, the librarian themselves actually make the decision as to what the correct action is. So it's fairly simple, and there's actually no command line work on our part to actually resolve any issues. And the last thing I'd like to talk about is librarians are very creative, and they have this thing about not tagging abstracts with the right language. And you'd be surprised how many times Spanish comes up when it's not Spanish. So we've created a little bit of an AI code that actually retags a language on all the abstracts to make sure that we have the right languages whenever there's a string involved. The code is available on the web. We use pretty much everything under the sun, including Perl and Django and Python, the generic ontology tools. And we do have a GitHub where all of the code used for CanaLien is available. Sharon?
Thanks, back to the short person. So as Rob mentioned, we aimed for some core functionality, and one of the core pieces is that we wanted this web tool for transforming MARC data, because we wanted to make sure that you didn't have to be an expert in linked data, you didn't have to necessarily understand all the technology underlying the ontology that we're using and so on and so forth. So we developed a web tool where you can upload a single MARC record or a set of MARC records, and it will transform it according to the ontology. And as Rob mentioned, it will spit out any issues into GitHub, so it's got that GitHub integration. You can go to GitHub and you can say, oh yeah, you know, this is actually this degree, or it wasn't coded quite right. You can correct that through the GitHub issue, and it will push it back into the triple store on the server, which is very cool. So again, hopefully, lowering the barrier in terms of technology expertise that you need to have in order to participate. We've also set up a very basic UI. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but through the interface, you can do Sparkle queries. So there is the link to the Sparkle server. If you're so inclined to play around with Sparkle and you want to do that, you can do that for sure. But knowing that not everybody wants to do that, we wanted to make a really basic UI where you can do keyword searching. You can also search for by title, school, subject, and author. And also, we wanted to set up functionality to tweet when new theses or a new thesis was submitted to the system. And as Rob mentioned as well, we also wanted to make sure that the citation for the theses could be downloaded in multiple formats, and also that there are daily data dumps available in multiple formats as well. So why theses? As I mentioned earlier on, one of the ideas around theses, number one, was that all of the institutions who are participating in the project have graduate programs, they have theses. This is a quote from a friend of Rob's, actually, who sort of says that theses are write many, read once documents. So quite often they're one of those things that students, we put so much work into them, and then they're read by the student and their supervisor and their committee, and then sometimes they're sort of lost, and there's just a lot of intellectual value there, which is often not very discoverable, and we wanted to help change that. In terms of sort of sunk costs and kind of the value, we've got a few slides here of data from Stats Canada just indicating the value and the number of graduate theses that are created in Canada each and every year. And if you look at this is from 2012, so the data is getting a little bit old now, but sort of you can see kind of the exponential. Can I get a? Oh, I thought I might be able to get a little pointer there. But large number of increase in theses and dissertations, in particular master's theses, more than double over that 20-year period, and doctoral theses as well. And based on the idea that sort of numbers range, but estimates that sort of a student graduate program costs anywhere from between $10,000 and $50,000 a year, between student costs, institution costs, supervision, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of, if you like to talk in numbers, there's a lot of value based in those, let alone the intellectual value. So that was part of the reason why we wanted to focus on theses as wonderful, unique intellectual output of these institutions.
There are a few quick notes here that I wanted to point out about data quality from the libraries. There's a lot of creativity in the MARC records. There's a lot of obsolete fields within MARC records. And that's a concern because it means nobody's actually looked at that record since it was created. It also means that when we try and consume that record, the software is no longer capable of handling it. So we have a problem in that we have bit rot within the system already, just as at the data level. Some creativity in terms of people have been adding electronic thesis in the middle of the thesis title, or they'll do creative things such as, say, the author field will have John Doe and co-supervised by someone else. This is problematic because these records will never be retrieved. And I urge you to consider the algorithmic self-interest of the people that consume your data. There are 8 billion people on this planet. Most of them don't speak English or French. Most of them don't even use the Latin alphabet by a long shot. Any time that you put data into a field in a different creative format, you increase the cost of consuming that record. And then it becomes to the point where it falls to the bottom of the floor because nobody has the computational time to actually clean up your record for consumption or for searching. So I understand that we do this for a number of historical reasons, including trying to put French and English in the same field because we can't do it any other way. But in these cases, we need to fix the system because this data will never be consumed. We simply do not have the time or the crunching power to handle it at the scale, at the planetary scale. And I'm sorry to say that in 2017, we still haven't figured out character encodings. So another issue that was rather interesting is we would get data from the same university, but from different systems. And in many cases, the data would differ for the same thesis, which is again, an interesting comment about the quality and the way that the workflows work in certain institutions. So we know that there's a lot more value in MARC records. In certain cases, we had to drop it because we weren't able to access it. A number of institutions have been trying to use field 0 in MARC records for authority names. That's resulted in some interesting situations where some students had Montreal as a degree type. And that doesn't quite parse in our universe, so we had to drop those. So our next step will be to clean up the UI. And I fully realize that the UI we have right now has a certain 1998 feel to it. And I'm sorry, UI is not what we do for a living, so we will get somebody who has a little bit more of a design and style sense than we do. We are looking at long-term homes for this project in terms of getting the data to be perpetuated and updated as we go along. And we have better quality data checking on the way. We use a number of what we call Zamboni process, which every night go through the entire database and try and clean up records that have problems with them. Case in point, a number of records are missing the number of pages. That's pretty much the data you need for a citation. So we have a Zamboni process that does creativity with the PDF file to try and rebuild the record as much as possible. All of our code is on the web. You're more than welcome to criticize it or try and play around with it. The Sparkle server will happily answer your queries. And we have the usual linked open data description for our data available. So if you have an institution that creates a master's or PhD thesis from time to time, and you'd like to give us the records, please come and talk to me or Sharon. We'd love to talk to you. Thank you.
Ask a question. So your approach of localizing all the theses from across different universities into one triple store is probably because to have a single Sparkle point so that everybody can, and I know there are technological issues to have multiple Sparkle points and to query them simultaneously. So my question is, are we any closer to the point where each library with thesis can choose to be their own Sparkle point, and the promise of linked data is that we shouldn't be doing all this work to consolidate into a local store. And the technology is so open that every library is a point of query or a data store in itself. Will that promise be ever realized, or is that possible, do you think? Because that is the ultimate promise, is that you don't have to do any programming or consolidation for link. At least that's what I understood, but I know practically it's difficult to get to the point, so I'm just trying to understand if this is a stepping point or is this is the way to go.
Can I answer? So one of the lessons from IT history is that we would always ping pong in between having a very big one of something and having a lot of little somethings running around. And in Rob Warren's ideal world, I think every library should have their own Sparkle server and take care of their own thesis because that's the raison d'être. So that would be my ideal world. In this particular case, we had a few libraries in the room when we said we should fix this problem and do it once. And that's what happened. And they're all very willing to put the records into this. And there's only one point of maintenance, one point of functionality. However, if any of you would like to clone the system and put it into your university, please go ahead. We'll give you a hand to actually set it up. And in my ideal world, again, is everybody would have a Sparkle server. And we do have the technology to make distributed queries work. It's just that not every university has the will or the capability to actually deploy one of these.
Hi, I really appreciate the work that you're doing and the fact that by the act of creating this work, you're creating authority records for people. I was just curious if there have been any people who've approached you to say, this is a great opportunity to add, say, ORCID IDs or other sort of identifiers that aren't necessarily from your project, but this would be a sort of a perfect point to add it. And then I guess one of the challenges, though, with ORCID IDs is that it would require, I guess, permission from the individual.
That's a really great question. Thank you. Yeah, we did talk a lot about ORCIDs, and the UBC in the records that they created, actually, they did a search, and for all the records they submitted, they looked for ORCID IDs for those individuals as well, included those when they found them, which we think would be really, really valuable. They ran into a lot of challenges in terms of the amount of effort needed to find out whether there were ORCID IDs that existed already out there for individual users. So definitely a great way to enhance the data for sure, and we would love to be able to have that ORCID IDs if they've got LC, if they've got VIAF, if they've got local, whatever they've got, the more the better. And we've done, at the U of A, just for our own repository, we've done some work with the ORCID API to try and see how much matching we can do with ORCID in terms of our theses, authors, and so on in our repository. And, we're getting a little bit of match, but not a lot, just because it hasn't got a lot of uptake yet. But I think that's definitely something we would like to see more and in the future, and it was something that would enhance the data for sure. But still some challenges early on, but I think it's got a lot of promise for sure.
You've solicited universities to submit records to you. Have you looked at something like OAI to harvest, or does OAI not actually supply you enough data? Because often it's based on something smaller like DC. Even though you can ask for MARC, a lot of times those MARC records aren't. They're not as complete as you might get out of a catalog system.
Right, that's a really good question. And the way, because we were sort of doing a small pilot group, what we wanted to do is originally we thought, hey, let's open it up and let's put out a call across Canada asking everybody to send us their records. And then we sort of rethought that and said, well, maybe we should actually have a little something to show people first before we kind of go out soliciting, so we can say, hey, look what you can do with your data. So it was very scoped in that way, but we did talk about actually, because Library and Archives Canada is a member of our working group, and they were really actually interested in the project and so on. And so we did talk about actually harvesting all the metadata from the Theses Canada portal and importing it in. We just didn't have a time to do that. But that's a really good point, because I know a lot of institutions at the University of Alberta, for example, are repository records are actually much richer in terms of what they have in the metadata for the theses. They have committee members and supervisors and all that kind of data. So we actually used our repository records rather than our MARC records. And so we know that's a huge potential source. And I'd love us to see us be able to do that. And so I think we're still talking with LAC about maybe, if we can get some time, get some resources and grow this project, we want to be able to think about trying to harvest for sure.
In terms of, since you're ingesting MAC records, I think it's, have you figured out a way to link outside the data set in terms of when you're describing the object? Let's say, what is this about? Is there a way to describe it in terms of, instead of using a literal, like a URI, say to a DBpedia URI or something like that, it allows you, and if so, how to, because it's challenging, but I think it's quite important.
So yes, we do link, so obviously the subject headings are linked to as URIs. The universities are also linked through DBpedia, because that was the fastest identifiers we could find for universities. So it's fairly straightforward to add that kind of data. Again, the question is, it comes out in a MARC format. Where did we get that MARC format from? And the field zeros are not standardized enough for us to be able to trust them en masse right now.